Well, thank you, Kate, and thank you for Rob and the rest for the invitation. It's very nice to be here. This is a slightly onerous task, and this is the first lecture I've given in probably 20 years without slides. Well, it's not a lecture then, is it? I'm going to try and put together some thoughts that have been stimulated by the day. I did actually bring a bunch of slides, but I thought I'll use them if nothing interesting comes up. But it's actually been pretty interesting, so I won't. We'll see how this goes. It's not very well organised. I began, it's about, how long ago? Just about when Place and Placelessness came out, 1976. 1977 I started a master's degree at the University of Melbourne. And part of that, I was talking to some geographers, and one of them at Monash said, "Oh, you should read this book that's just come out." And it was Ted's book, and it was really quite a revelation, this wonderful introduction not only to phenomenology, but to a whole lot of categories and ways of thinking about place and about placelessness. And I remain very indebted to that work, even though I've moved on a little bit. I later went to graduate school. I went to do a PhD at Berkeley, where I felt that a number of people who were thinking in this way were working. Christopher Alexander, Claire Cooper Marcus, Donald Appleyard, Lars Lerop, and there was, of course, there's other North Americans, Jane Jacobs, Kevin Lynch, and so on, who were still around. And I discovered that none of them had ever read any phenomenology. Actually, that's not true of Lars Lerop, but none of them, in a sense, they didn't need the philosophy or the social theory in order to do what they were doing, which reminds me a little bit of Lucy's comment about how place is kind of embedded, and a lot of people either don't think about it much or don't talk about it, or perhaps have relegated it to that category that John was mentioning a little while ago of words that you don't, what was the comment, John? Words you don't use unless you're being a bit careless, something like that. And I have felt like that at times, but I've always come back to the concept of place because it doesn't go away, and it's not going to go away. And I think that the reason that that's the case is that it's such an everyday term that is so widely used and understood by people in their everyday life, and is of such concern to them at another level. When I came back from grad school, I was co-organiser of a conference to which we invited Ted as a keynote speaker. This is mid-80s. And in those days, in order to get anything printed, you had to send it off to what was called a copy setter. Now, at least half the audience won't know what this means. Someone who ran a typewriter effectively and did printing that you could then send off to the printer. And it came back, instead of, the conference was called Place and Placemaking. So I think this was actually quite early in the introduction of such discourse, at least in Australia. And it came back called lace making. So we had a bit of a laugh about this. Lace is something that you put together intricately. You need quite a lot of patience, where you thread one thing, you connect one thing another together, and so on. And anyway, we thought it was a spelling mistake. I didn't have much patience, and it took me a while to figure out that it was a bit more than a spelling mistake, because in many ways I think place and placemaking are a bit like lace and lace making. Not much further down the track, I was asked by someone who has to remain nameless. It's useful doing a talk that's not going to be published, even though, no, I'm sure the camera's not running. Someone who shall remain nameless, who asked me to come in as a kind of a sub-consultant on a job that he had. I was reminded of this story this morning, so I decided to tell it. Because I went for a walk from the hotel, which is just up the road, and down to the Opera House. Some people from Melbourne do have Sydney envy, we go and we secretly look at the Opera House while we're here. And I did this morning. It's still beautiful. The harbour is still beautiful. But Circular Quay is still blocked by the walk that you take along the top of the Botanical Gardens by a bunch of buildings. Anyway, when I went to do this consultancy job with this guy in Melbourne, and he wanted to pick my brains about place theory, and he wanted to understand something about Circular Quay in Sydney Harbour as a place. And I realised after about 2 or 3 hours of this that What he wanted was for me to come up with some Norberg Schultz-like arguments as to how Circular Quay should be more fully enclosed, that it would be better to have more buildings surrounding it, that in fact he was hired by the developers for what later I think was christened by Robert Hughes as the toaster. Some of you, you're a Sydney crowd, you wouldn't know this. And there it is, it's still there, as I noticed this morning. But the lesson in this is that the discourses of place, and I was alert to this fairly on, it's a kind of a motherhood discourse. It is a very dangerous discourse. It is a warm and fuzzy word. It's a bit like community. It's a bit like home. It's a little bit like character. These are words that you can't easily argue with. So I was, in a sense, arguing from early on about to take a kind of a critical approach to this. I will move on, or I'll just eat up all of the time with this. But I also ended up with a kind of a side career of working with residents groups in Melbourne, trying to help them understand urban development processes, in some cases fighting urban developments that seemed to be very damaging to place, and often in planning tribunals where developers with large amounts of money and very expensive Queen's councils and consultants would come in and utilise the discourse of place to say how much they were going to contribute to the city through this new 14-storey building in a 2-storey neighbourhood. And you knew that where this was going, eventually they'll buckle and settle for about 10 or 11 storeys and the damage will be done. And this was happening over and over again, often with the discourse of not just place but of landmarks, of gateways. Gateways are especially valuable because you need 2 very big buildings to create a gateway, right? Not just one. And then last night, I don't know how many of you are watching this very interesting program called Utopia, the new Rob Sitch comedy, where there was on last night a developer who wanted to build a 55-storey, I think, tower on the Brisbane River. And it was all full of the discourse of he wanted to offer something back to the city. He wanted to contribute. And there's this wonderful one-liner at the end from Rob Sitch. Could we ask him to contribute a little bit less? That place gets wrapped up in this discourse of development and indeed to a kind of a neoliberal discourse. And that came up today. I think that the question that John said was too hard, and he was right, or I think you rejected 2 questions on the basis they were too hard, didn't you? This was one of them, and it was really underneath it all about what do we do in the face of a kind of political context of neoliberalism. If we look back at the history that has been traversed throughout today and set in part by this kind of trope of Ted's book from 1976 and everything that's happened since then, and the title of this conference, Place and Placelessness in the 21st Century, and I think that's a pretty interesting kind of way to look at this, is we've really come a long way since then. How far have we come? What have we got? Where are we going? What are the discourses of today say about what's happened across that period of time? So it's an interesting question. A part of my cynicism's the wrong word. My sense of a critical attitude to the concept of place, and nearly all of my books have had the word place in the title, so it's framing places, becoming places. I've always been committed to the idea of trying to reframe what it is that place means, but I've always been worried about this, the ease with which place got sucked into the discourse, particularly the discourses of neoliberalism, the discourses of privatisation, of gated communities which construct an instant sense of place separated and privatised from the public realm. The use of place as propaganda, but also the use of words like community and home, and the way in which the development industry advertising subsumes all of that as well. In a sense, I saw it as a kind of theft, because the word place to me belongs to everyday life. We should be able to go on using the word place. We should be able to say, this is a great place. It means something different than this is a great space, which is somehow more formal and less social. And I've got to say, I see place very much as socio-spatial, intimately connected, the two, people and place together. So this, in a sense, this co-option, there was a word someone else used today. You're going to have to forgive me, I've forgotten all of the authors all of these bits and pieces have been crowded together in my notes here, but this idea of a place being co-opted and becoming a kind of propaganda is kind of important. Ted started with the number plates from your home state, which said, from memory, the best place to be, right?
Best place on earth.
The best place on earth. Well,
Victoria is the place to be, isn't it? That's the license plates in Victoria.
Yes, Melbourne's the place to be. How can you be the best place on earth if we're the place to be? They can't both be true. What we see is a set of kind of reductionisms, and this adoption of the discourses of place as a kind of text then leads into a kind of a deconstruction of that text, which is sort of what we're beginning to do here today. But then a lot of that deconstructionist discourse, which of course comes from a different theoretical paradigm, also leads in many cases to what I'd see as a reduction of place to text. In the sense, you strip place of anything other than being a text. In the words of Derrida, there is nothing outside the text. It's as if somehow the sense of place in everyday life is kind of erased or reduced to some kind of statement. I saw that as a real danger, that somehow we lose the potency of place in the best and the worst senses of that word. Potency being, of course, about power, the power of place in our lives, the power of place to sustain us, but also the power of place to frame our lives in ways that are against our interests, the uses of place as a mediation of oppressive practices of power, which was the subject of the book Framing Places. But there are other kinds of reduction too, and the reduction to essence, the so-called essentialism argument, has one that's always stuck with me as well. The sense, as Ted put it, of place going too far and becoming exclusionary. I think I should say, by the way, just in passing, that if you like, that tension between Ted's work and Massey's work, I think was a productive tension, although I think there was a kind of a deliberate setting up of a straw man over that issue. I like Massey's work, but I like Ted's work as well. I think a part of what we're seeing here today, and what we need to see a lot more of, is in fact moving beyond binaries. Now that's the theme that has come up again and again. Some of the ones that were coming up, firstly, the major one, if you like, the master one, for today anyway, place and placelessness. This idea of turning it into a circle or turning it into a figure eight, or indeed seeing it as, what was your metaphor? The idea of non-dualistic approaches, but you had a word for it, Ted, and I've forgotten it now. Right, it's escaped me. Intertwined, something like that.
Oh, yeah.
They were intertwined rather than or hybrid was the other one that you used.
And opposed polarities.
At least
they're all actually from Auger.
Right. Okay. So it's about a matter of moving on beyond the kind of binary thinking that sees things as either or. Now I'm going to come back a little bit later to, if I get time, to approaches that might have some kind of purchase on those kind of between conditions. My word for it, by the way, is probably a twofold, something where one folds into the other. There's been a lot of talk in various contexts here today too about the idea of character being perhaps a partial synonym for place, and the way in which particularly resident groups focus on character as something that needs to be contested, fought over in some cases. I spent a fair bit of my life organising interviews around trying to figure out what it was that people meant when they said that the inappropriate development was destroying or damaging the urban character of their neighbourhood. And in one or two sentences, the brief answer was that they meant at least two or three different things. In the case of neighbourhoods in Melbourne that were being defended against change, there were neighbourhoods where urban character meant this place has a legacy, it has history, and I'm responsible for helping to defend that. And this is a comfort zone. It is a place of a kind of a consistency and a purity that we must keep out those things that damage it. Now, this was Camberwell, this is all published. In some cases, this was a very thin cover for a kind of racism, a kind of keeping out difference, keeping out, using the planning scheme to keep out the wrong kinds of people under the cover of keeping out the wrong kinds of buildings. This is a kind of purified sense of place that was, in a sense, being defended here. But the other one, which came from more inner city locations, character was defined in terms of difference. It was defined in terms of a mix. It was defined in terms of this is a place that has lots of different people, it has lots of different buildings, it has different building heights, it has different building types, it has a mix of different interfaces with the street, and that mix is the thing that's worth preserving. This new bad development is going to destroy the mix by flooding it with all one thing. So these are almost polar opposed notions of what place identity or character means. And my sense is that that is the way the world is. We don't simply decide that one is right or that one is wrong. They're both senses of place. One of them is highly exclusionary and problematic and essentialist, and the other is not. Another way to put it is that one is linked to that idea of a bounded sense of place. The other one is linked much more to the space of flows. This transformation that we've had described from a number of different speakers here today between a kind of a fixed and rooted sense of place into a more fluid and unbounded space of flows of overlapping identities. What Massey calls a global sense of place, a progressive sense of place. But in doing that, I also want to say I think that Massey adopts the same kind of polarising attitude that I was arguing against. She abandons, if you like, any sense of an ontology of place in her trenchant opposition to Heidegger, whom she probably hasn't read. I think she's a very good geographer in a whole lot of ways, but I think that essentialising, in my own view about Heidegger, is that there are essentialist elements of Heidegger, but his basic notions about the spatiality of being and the ontologies of space are great insights that are worth keeping. I want to say a little bit about scale. A lot of the discourse around place ignores the fact that place is one of these wonderful multi-scalar concepts. It operates from the space of a desktop to a room, to a building, to a street, to a neighbourhood, to a city, to a nation, and that there's a lot of resonances between them. And not often enough do we see those resonances explored in the talk, in the literature, and the research. You get this stuff about border control and so on that often operates at a national scale. We have a gated community at a national scale. We kind of oppose, by and large, gated communities at neighbourhood scale, and then we support them again when it gets down to the scale of a building. This is an interesting, I think that I would like to know a lot more about this. I see this as just a field that's starting to open up. And also in relation to time, I think there's not enough focus on the smaller scales. There's been an awful lot of really high-level attention to this from geography, probably not enough high-level attention from the disciplines that are actually engaged in the transformation of built form, architecture, landscape, urban design. Something else that John said about it's the ground floor that counts, is what I wrote down, and that cities are built out of streets. So I agree with that. I think it's a fairly fundamental insight. And I think it's to do with the fact that the phenomenology of place still occupies a very key place. To me, it's not the only thing. Discourse analysis matters, other forms of analysis matter, but that in the end, the city succeeds or fails in terms of the ways in which our feet hit the pavement, the ways in which our glances meet those of other people, the ways in which we run into people we haven't planned to meet in the street, the ways in which buildings frame that space, the ways in which landscapes frame that space, and so on. So that if the streets work, then by and large other things work. But there's still a kind of a need for the multi-scale analysis. There's been a few references today to time as well, and I think that time again has been that the city, to see the city in terms of time and to see the landscape in terms of time, and that some very large long-term decisions get made that last for hundreds of years, and a lot of urban design decisions are like that, I've got to say. And then there's a lot of others that have very, very short time windows. We're seeing not a resurgence, a kind of a surge, I think, in what you might call temporary urbanism. the rise of a relatively informal form of placemaking that fills the gaps in time as well as the gaps in place. I think one of the great paradoxes of place is that sometimes a really bad design creates a vacuum into which really, really interesting things happen. Leonard Cohen put it pretty well. He said, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So, where would we go with this? Where I would go, I wanted to just mention three kind of frameworks, the ones that I kind of use, and what I see as the two big challenges, and we'll leave it there. One is, I think that as part of moving from this kind of older paradigm of looking at binary oppositions and defining things in opposition to each other, and in terms of trying to see the interconnections between them, the intertwinings, not necessarily blurring the difference between them. One of those I'd like to see is between the sciences and the humanities. I think there's an awful lot happening in the sciences at the moment that has great relevance for place. And a part of that I see as the key parts of that are related to complex adaptive systems thinking, complexity theory, theories of emergence. Spatial syntax theory I think is reasonably productive. There's a lot of study of a lot of stuff there that links into the next part, which is really about urban morphology. I rather like the graphics for the conference brochure, which is just this wonderful map of Sydney, where you can't really see the whole of Sydney. You can't really see the parts of Sydney, but you can kind of put them to... there it is, there's a piece of it. It's the Cadastral Maps. I really like maps. I actually think that maps introduce us to a different kind of spatial knowledge. Just to flip back to that urban character work, one of the things and one of the reasons we were doing that was that urban character had been raised to a position of great importance in the planning scheme for Victoria, where during the rampant neoliberal era of the late 1990s, residents were saying, we have to protect urban character. The state said, fine, no problem. Must protect urban character became sort of the number one priority for all new development applications. And of course the developers came in and said, here we have our 14-storey building in the 2-storey neighbourhood, and here's what we've done to respect the neighbourhood character. No problem. Why won't you pass it? So it's like an infinitely malleable kind of discourse, and it really did nothing other than to create a hole that you could drive a truck through in the planning scheme. So in a strange kind of way, and this links to something else that was raised today about performance versus prescriptive codes, in many ways I've come to the belief that we have to get over that kind of binary as well. In many cases it is prescriptive codes that perform best in terms of trying to manage change in highly valued places. The mapping and the morphology, the complex adaptive systems type approaches to understanding the processes, the morphogenetic processes that underlie built form, that trying to understand the ways in which place, a sense of place, the experience of place, emerges from a complexity that we will never be able to predict fully. And that leads to the last bit here, which is really social theories of assemblage that derive from Deleuze and Guattari, that I think also give us a key insight into the ways in which cities work. In this model, you can see place as assemblage, which was the title of a chapter that I wrote a few years ago, or place as multiplicity, which is the title I gave to this talk that Kate refused to tell you. Where is she? There she is. And you can also, I think, see from that perspective the idea of place as a plateau. The wonderful book by Deleuze and Guattari is called 1,000 Plateaus. It's a close to unreadable book. I do know that. You just got to read it about 5 or 6 times from different directions. The plateau comes from Gregory Bateson, who's the great anthropologist, who theorised the notion of a plateau as a phenomenon that emerges, he saw it as a cultural phenomenon, when you have an escalation of basically a communication system that escalates to a certain level and then certain controls are self-organised. A plateau because it's a level between levels that is pulled between different tensions. Plateau has the same etymology as place as well. But this is an approach too that tries to look at the idea that place is not something that is made by designers, but something that emerges from the multitudes of decisions that are made by planners, by designers, by residents, by everyone. The two challenges, I'll end on this. One of the things I noticed today that no one talked about, what I see is the one person, or a couple did talk marginally about one of these. What I see is the two biggest challenges. One of them is global poverty. I didn't see any photographs of informal settlements. So if I was to bring a slide to illustrate mine that hasn't already been illustrated, it would be a slide of informal settlements. Over 1 billion people in the world live this way. We talk a lot about this being the age of urbanisation, as the age when we now have a majority of people living in cities on the planet. There has been this massive rural to urban migration over the last 50 years. Now, we didn't house them in the suburbs on the outer rims of our cities. They're housed, by and large, in the interstices of developing cities of the so-called global south, where there's over 1 billion people, and most of them have self-organised. Most of them have settled in informal settlements in what are sometimes very, very slummy conditions. There's sometimes squatters, there's sometimes not. It's a very, very complex situation. But I didn't see any talk about that, and I think that if we can't learn to engage as Western professionals with that situation, and for the most part, we know very little about it. They're under-researched at a micro-scale level, and it's just a huge kind of problem. It's one that I've been increasingly trying to spend my time on, but just getting access is really a very difficult task. I said there were two, and the other one, and it's not unlinked, is climate change. Informal settlements are mostly car-free. They're mostly built out of recycled materials. They're mostly relatively low-rise, high-density. They're walkable. And in some cases, they have a phenomenally interesting, accessible and safe sense of everyday life within them. There are always problems: lack of open space, lack of opportunity for the kids, sometimes very, very closed, inward-looking, other times not. But in some ways, they have a lot of resonances with some of the models that are emerging for how we all should be living. Better use of materials, use of less space, higher densities but low rise, good protection of open space, highly walkable. And a lot of that has to do with transit-oriented development. So the other really big challenge is, how does the rich world, the world of 99% of the slides that we looked at today, how do we transform that to make it for a low-carbon future? Because the carbon emissions have to come down dramatically. If there was a fair world and the poor were to live at our levels, there is no future for the planet. So the only sustainable outcome is a massive transformation of the formal cities of the rich West. How are we going to manage that transformation? Because that is a transformation of place. In cities like mine in Melbourne, we're undergoing huge growth, but hardly anyone has an understanding of how much place transformation is actually necessary in order to get where we need to go. We need to get people out of their cars into public transport, and at the moment we're just going backwards in that. And how are we going to manage that kind of transformation of place experience when there's fairly high levels of resistance to even the most minor forms of change? I disagree a little bit with Kate's comments earlier that children are necessarily disadvantaged by increased densities and urban intensification. I think the opportunities for children, if we get the design right, go up. There's much, much more opportunity for children. I see most of the suburbs as relatively placeless, and when fuel prices go up and car usage becomes more problematic, especially out on the fringe, then the opportunities for those kids are going to go down even further. So I'm going to end with those two challenges. But, yeah.